I guess I'll start by giving a bit of a trigger warning. So we will be discussing abuse in sport. I'll probably make references to sexual abuse specifically, and trauma more widely. And I'm going to start off by kind of setting the scene. So what is Kyniska if you haven't heard of us? Who am I? Why am I here? Kind of rephrasing that person first, athlete second, that we're still working on trying to get into place, and do we currently still have a situation where it's actually person second, athlete first? What are the barriers to change, and why is it slow moving? And a couple of recommendations, I guess. So firstly on Kyniska, we're about to have our third birthday. We are an athlete-led safe sport organisation. I'm an athlete and our co-founder Kate is also an athlete. We're survivor-led, and we started as a campaigning single-issue organisation to implement lifetime bans for coaches who were found guilty of sexual misconduct and abuse. And we've kind of grown from there because we recognised it as an issue, and we couldn't see any other organisations that were athlete-led and putting that kind of young person athlete voice at the centre of this discussion. We've just recently launched our first official strategy, so we're becoming a bit more of a legitimate organisation. And we primarily work through three principal missions: to advocate, to support, and to educate. I'll send the slides round post so we can go into more detail on these. And so I guess more on the context, that's Kyniska, who am I? So I'm an athlete, I've been a coach, I've been a teacher, and I'm an advocate. I'm also a survivor of sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, the lot. And I guess my story as a child athlete was really positive. I had a great experience, I loved my club, I had an amazing time. And for me, the real danger and the problem didn't really start until I moved to university. And I guess that's a question I want to pose today is, when do we stop becoming children, or when do we stop being children, and when do we become adults? Because for me, when my dangerous situation was presented to me, I would still consider myself to have been a child. I was 18, but by law, I was an adult. So I'm able to recognize danger, I'm able to advocate for myself, I'm able to protect myself, apparently. And I suppose over a period of time, I was in a really abusive coaching environment, along with a bunch of other athletes. And my welfare and well-being wasn't prioritised, which led to an eating disorder, unsurprisingly, anxiety and poor performances. Yes, there were some positive performances, of course, otherwise I wouldn't still be here. But at what cost, I guess, is the kind of overarching question today. So before we go into what that means, how does it feel in your sport? Do you think we've got a person second, athlete first? What does performance look like? What does enjoyment look like in your sport? Because if we think about today, the discussion has been primarily about children's sport, children's enjoyment of exercise, but we have to remember that it exists, I'm saying underneath, not because it's less important, but because it happens earlier in your life. What sits above children's sport is the rest of the world of sport, which is based on performance, which is based on medals, which is based on striving for success. And if that's what children are looking up to, and that model isn't protecting those people's rights and welfare, how are children supposed to have their welfare and rights protected? If this has been such a push for such a long time, is it because the systems above it are preventing that change from happening? And as Forbes said, this is difficult. It's not easy. If it was easy, we'd have done it by now. Resources are tight. Sports have got loads of competing demands and priorities, and some sports are really small, some sports are bigger. The bigger sports are potentially doing more, but maybe not doing it consistently across the board. And that's where a lot of the problems become, because your safety and your welfare and your enjoyment of sport is dependent on your postcode and the sport that you choose to compete in. I also want to refer back to something Nick said earlier, that children are rights holders, and that's so true, but so are all sports people, so everybody that's participating in sport, regardless of your age, your gender, your race, as the video demonstrated when we came back in this afternoon. Yes, you've got the right, But again, what if the systems aren't allowing you to exercise that right? And I think that's where we're really trying to change things. If I move on. If we're looking at the sport as with a capital S, the national governing body sport, the Olympic sports, the podium sports, if you like, we talk about athletes as people. There's been lots of discussions in recent years about athletes aren't commodities. What is a commodity? It's a product. But who are the athletes in this conversation? Are we considering them as active stakeholders? Are we considering them as employees? Do they have employee rights? Do they have the right to a welfare programme? Do they have the right to well-being resources and mental health support? Quite often the answer is no, unless they're on a performance programme. But what about people who are participating in grassroots or community sport? How do we get those people to have the support and access to resources that they actually need to be able to fully enjoy sport? And I guess it's not this isn't a historic problem that we often think that it is. This is happening today. Just yesterday, I myself, as an athlete, signed a contract waiving my moral rights under the Data Protection and Copyright Act irrevocably and unconditionally over my image, voice, likeness, and my biographical material. So I too am a product, and I can't escape it because I want to compete. So if I want to compete, I have to play the game. I have to sign the contract and waive away my personal rights to be a part of the system. And these are private organizations that play a part in our sport. So I guess if those models are existing, and until they don't, how can we operate children's sport to be different to what the model that they're aspiring to is, I guess, is the message I'm trying to deliver. And a lot of what we say when we're talking about athletes as commodities and why potentially abuse happens and why these dangerous environments come to exist is because we talk about, again and again, success at all costs. This happens because we have a success at all costs mentality. But what does that mean? And my partner's great because he's not an athlete and not involved in sports, so he's always like prodding me to be like, what does that mean? I don't get it, which is great. Success at all costs means that funding structures rely on medal counts. So sports are trying to get more money so that they can run as a business, so that they can run and function and provide all of the opportunities that they want to, so that they can have the youth forums, so they can do all of the good things. But in order to do those things, they need medals. So at some point, the priority is not the nice stuff that protects people's rights. It's actually, let's get another performance coach in, let's improve that gym facility, let's get in a talk on how to, reach your dreams and use your nutrition to, maximize your performance rather than actually feed your body for what you're asking it to do. And I think that the result or what it means, a success at all costs environment means that athletes ultimately break. And it's not just standalone cases like these athletes that you might recognize as Mhairi Kane, who was a victim of emotional and physical abuse at the hands of Nike that was hidden and, I suppose, knowingly done. And she was performing, so who cares, right? If the athletes aren't speaking up, it's fine, because if there was a problem, they'd speak up. Or Simone Biles, who was also a victim of sexual abuse, but she didn't speak up initially, right? So it's fine. And a lot of these cases happen during legitimate sports-related practices, like going to a massage or having a medical examination. But what it actually means is not these standalone cases. It's a whole cohort of athletes who, across sports, across genders, across races, across ages, who fall victim to that success at all costs culture that sits inherently in sport. I told you I wasn't going to be delivering the heartwarming message. I'm really sorry. Because athletes are commodities, we're not classed as employees. We are the product. And if that's the standard for these elite adult athletes, then we cannot get community sport and athlete sport and children's sport to be any different, ultimately. It starts young. We've got talent scouting at football. We've got young kids who are joining football clubs because they want to be famous, successful football players. It means that bigger sports like football, who have greater spectatorship, are the sports where kids go to more often. We have codes of conduct for athletes when they go to big competitions, putting pressure on them to behave in a certain way. And what do they get for that? To represent their country. But there's no expectation on what their rights are. This is what is expected of you, but you won't get anything in return apart from the vest. Do you have somebody supporting you there? What can you expect from the people who are taking you? Who are the people that are taking you? So I guess to pause, I want to just ask you, is welfare important? I'm going to ask you again, is welfare important? Yes, welfare is important. But I guess I want you to take a moment to reflect. When you're watching sport on a Saturday, whether it's the Olympics or World Championships, or if it's just a local league football game, what are you looking for? What do you want to get out of that experience of watching sport? Do you want to watch a good game? Do you want to watch lots of goals being scored? Do you want to see the highest jump or the fastest time? Do you actually care as a spectator about the rights of that person? If we're really honest with ourselves, the answer is maybe no, because we actually are using that for enjoyment. It's entertainment, because sport is an entertainment product. So spectators actually have a huge amount of say in how we change this, because if spectators start to vote with your watches or your views, or if spectators vote with their feet, then clubs might be forced to, or sports might be forced to actually prioritize the rights. How do we get that to happen is another question. So what are the barriers to this happening? Well, like I said, spectators, we want to create a good product. We want to give spectators a good game. So the focus is performance. The focus is a good product. But we forget that the product is people. And those people were once children. And so if we're trying to create a good product from the beginning, we're looking at early professionalization, and it's so hard to focus on a rights-based approach if the ultimate goal is a good product. And those products are people. There's also limited resources. Sport is not exactly flush with cash, especially not from a Scottish government perspective. And again, that trickles down through sports councils and then to national governing bodies. There's no required spend on welfare. There's no required spend on safeguarding. It's just sports having to fulfill a couple of tick boxes to be able to get on and continue creating that product. So what does it look like if we switch that around and we don't have person second, athlete first, and we actually have person first, athlete second? I want to refer to a quote from Sally Munday. It's an aspirational quote. I'm just not sure how much truth there is in it. As in, at the moment, I totally agree with the sentiment. So she says, it's possible to be successful whilst embracing a culture that puts athletes' welfare and well-being at its very core. I strongly reject that it is an either or, and I do too. But at the moment, it's still on a case-by-case basis, and athletes that are doing that are going against the grain. So if I refer to myself, I rejected the opportunity to be, I'll just reverse a little bit to make that clearer. I left the abusive coaching environment, yay, reported my coach, and I moved on to an elite coach. She was a woman. I thought, this is going to be it for me. No more men, because I feel like women are going to understand me better. But unfortunately, it was a coach who was ingrained in the British system, who wanted me to give up my job with no financial security and move to where she was and give up my whole life for the sport and put all of my eggs in that performance basket with no assurance of success at the end of it. And I honestly crumbled under the pressure, and things almost got worse for a bit as I tried to figure out, how do I build my life and fit sport into it so that I'm happy, so that I have a sustainable experience? And for me, that meant going back to my roots. My coach now is the same coach I had when I was a kid. I went back to my childhood coach that I knew would prioritize my rights and my well-being. That's who I felt safe with. I stayed in Edinburgh. I have a full-time job. evidently, that's why I'm here. And I have a partner and a life outside of sport. Sport is something that I do, and it's a part of making me happy. And that seems so radical when I speak to other elite athletes who just live and breathe the sport because that's what they're encouraged to do. For me, that's led to sustainable and positive experiences. I don't feel crushed under the pressure. Yes, occasionally when I have to sign a crazy contract, signing away my moral rights, I question whether or not I'm a part of the problem. But then remember, I come here and I shout at all of you guys. So, it swings and roundabouts. But it's not just me. There are other athletes who've taken that step and spoken out and taken a move towards a rights-based approach for them, inspiring children that it is possible to live in a world that is safe, to live and practice in a sporting world that does prioritize their welfare. On your far right, I'm going to apologize in advance if my rights and lefts aren't that great. We have a Spanish athlete, Mariajo Perez, who's in the yellow. She was recently diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Before that, she was in the performance pathway, didn't feel like she was able to speak up about how she felt. I know her personally, and I always thought of her as somebody who just wasn't that happy, just didn't seem to enjoy being an athlete that much. Unbeknownst to me and everyone else around her, she was crumbling under that pressure to perform and had felt that since a child. From a very early age, she was encouraged, oh, you're really good, you've got a talent, you need to perform, you're going to be a great runner. And it wasn't until she tried to take her life that she realized, I need to build my life, and sport has to be a part of that jigsaw puzzle. And now she's going to the Olympics. So actually, to prioritize your welfare and well-being isn't this frilly side tick box that we're just adding in and is taking away from performance. Actually, it could lead to a more profitable business, which is maybe a crap way to frame it, but ultimately, sport is a business. And that is the same for kids' clubs. We all pay memberships to take our kids to clubs, right? They're businesses. And I think if we pretend that it's anything else, we're not really, and it's not bad to be a business, and it's not bad to strive for performance, but what's bad is to strive for performance in the face of, or, not prioritizing welfare and well-being. Mhairi Kane is now left her coach, and she has changed her nationality to Irish, so she's over to the Celtic side, amazing, which obviously has just made her happier by, by proxy, because we're better. And she's now training for something that actually is meaningful to her. Simone Biles, similarly, taking control over her career and saying, no, my mental health's not good right now, I'm stepping away from this competition. But the pressure on these athletes to not do that is high, and the price is high. They get negative media stories about them because they're stepping away. People think that they're giving up. People think it's showing weakness, because to be successful, you can't be weak. You can't show humanity, right? Wrong. So what we need to try and do is make these not standalone cases. This needs to be the standard. It needs to be that the exception is an athlete who doesn't have a positive experience, rather than that being the exception. So if sport is a business, I'm going to take a moment to have a look at these statistics from Forbes magazine on productivity and profitability in US businesses. Okay, I know it's a bit of a stretch to apply that to sport in the UK, but they showed that highly engaged teams show greater profitability by 21%. Employees who felt that their voices are heard are 4.6 times more likely to feel empowered to perform their best work. So if we apply that to sport and change those words to athletes, if we're giving athletes the opportunity to be engaged, whether those are children athletes, adult athletes, teenage athletes, young people athletes, people just participating in sport, if we're actually giving them a chance to be engaged, whether that's through opinion surveys, whether that's through working groups, whether that's through unions, whether it's through athlete commissions, giving them meaningful ways to engage with their sport and feed into changes, feed into policy, they're going to perform better because they care more, they're invested more, and they feel heard. So it's a bit of a no-brainer. So we need to treat sport like a business. So I guess a bit more on how. These are just my recommendations. There's millions of other ways that we can do this. So we've heard from some people who are on a young youth panel. Those are amazing. And in some sports, they're done really, really well. And at some ages, they're done really, really well. But at the moment, it's inconsistent. Why? Because sports don't have advice and recommendations on actually how to do those. I think the issue is that we have an implementation gap, both in policy, practice, and procedures. So we'll be given a policy like involve athletes in decision-making, full stop. How? Does that mean that you put out an Instagram post and the athletes liked it or commented? Does it mean that you put out a tweet? Does it mean you send an email or a newsletter? Or does it mean that you're bringing them into the board? Does it mean that you're bringing them into working groups within the organisation for inclusion and diversity, for safeguarding? How are you involving those voices, and how are you ensuring a wide range of voices? I thought it was really interesting when you guys stood up and said how you got involved. Sometimes it's you taking the initiative yourself, sometimes your manager's telling you to, sometimes it's that your mum's telling you to. How are we making those selection policies for those types of groups meaningful? How are we reaching the athletes that live in Shetland, that live in the Highlands, for example? I didn't even know what Scottish athletics was when I was 5. Sorry, not 5. Well, I definitely didn't when I was 5. But, you know, when I started competing, I didn't know what Scottish athletics was until I got selected for Scotland. I didn't know what Scottish student sport was until I got selected for them. In fact, I actually just thought that they were someone to represent. I didn't realise it was a governing body, and that was at age 20. If we're looking at the funding structures, I mentioned that earlier. At the moment, they mainly rely on medal count. And that makes sense because sport, fundamentally, if we look at its beginnings, you know, we're looking at the ancient Olympic Games. They are about success. We do want to see humans striving to achieve the best thing. It's cool to watch, right? But it's also trickling down to community and grassroots sports. So we need to take that into consideration when we're looking at funding structures. Can we be making funding rely on culture checks? Can we be making funding rely on satisfaction surveys? I know that sounds super radical, but imagine you put out a satisfaction survey and students or athletes or children say that they're 20% satisfied with their enjoyment of their sport, and that means the funding gets cut. It's always a risky thing to suggest because also we want people to participate in sport, and if we cut the funding, maybe there are fewer opportunities. So it's a real risky game. If we look at the codes for governance, that's a lever that Sport Scotland have, I'm sorry, Forbes. But looking at the criteria that sports have to meet in order to get their funding, we need to be adding things in like having boards for children to get involved. We need to add in criteria that forces a culture change rather than it just being a tick box exercise. Because if you include information about how to close the implementation gap, then sports will have more guidance. I think what's really hard is that sports are trying their best, but with limited information, limited resources, limited funding. Robust policies and procedures is a no-brainer, but again, it's having not just policies that stick there, like Forbes was suggesting when he was at swimming, that quite often it was follow the policy, get through the policy, and make sure that we've done everything right. Remember, we can be empathetic when we're going through these things, and that's really scary for sports because we don't want to get things wrong. We don't want to end up a victim of trying to be empathetic and people feeling offended or not protected as a result, but actually saying, I'm really sorry that this has been so difficult for you. I'm really sorry that you're finding this situation hard. You don't have to say, I'm sorry this happened to you, because potentially that jeopardizes the investigation. I understand that. But it's more about showing empathy without being really cold and clinical about it. This is in cases of abuse. And also comprehensive training, not just for staff, not just for welfare officers, but for literally everybody in the organisation and for athletes and parents. We need to be rolling out more training. We need to be, there's loads of organisations that have got free safeguarding and welfare training online. Use them, they're there. We need to actually be disseminating that information in ways that reach our audiences. Use social media, use Twitter. Have a separate Twitter for safeguarding updates. If you change a policy, let your members know. If you're a welfare officer, reintroduce yourself every time there's a new member at your club. It sounds stupid, but then people know who you are. Have a dedicated space at your club for raising welfare concerns. You know, you can say, hi, I'm the welfare officer. If you ever have a concern, I'll be by the steps. And then people know that that's a safe space. It sounds basic, but actually it can make people feel that they're able to raise something if there's something to raise. Done. I'm gonna turn that on.